Autumn is in the air. The leaves are turning, the days are getting shorter, the weather is getting cooler, and it's the perfect time to make a batch of delicious hard cider. I've made a bunch of cider over the years, and my absolute favorite recipe couldn't be easier. Simply ferment 5 gallons of cheap store-bought apple juice with a pouch of Imperial Yeast A40 GF Bubbles, a gluten-free yeast strain that has the ability to ferment fructose while amplifying the natural flavors of fruit the juice is from. Whether you back sweeten or add additional fruits, my favorites being mixed berries or mango, A40 GF Bubbles is awesome stuff, and thankfully it's currently in season. Learn more about this delicious yeast strain at imperialyeast.com and pick some up wherever Imperial Yeast is sold.
Tiny bubble.
Hey everybody, welcome to the 260th episode of the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and today I'm joined by contributor and host of the Brü Lab podcast, Cade Jobe, to answer a bunch of questions submitted by listeners of the show, something we do every 10th episode.
I love these Q&A episodes because it's always off the wall. And you know the other thing too, I always learn something new on these episodes. So like even though the reason I'm one of the ones answering the questions, it actually forces me to like make sure that I understand what I'm saying and articulating it correctly. So I appreciate them too.
Yeah, totally. One of the things I'm not the biggest fan of, actually, along those lines, is offering advice or like answering questions in a way that sounds like I'm certain that I'm right. Especially when there are a lot of questions we get asked that just don't have any hard right or wrong answers. And that, again, that's often the case in brewing, I feel. I know some people don't really agree with me on that. They want to hear an answer of certainty so that they can feel comfortable, making a decision. That's not what we're about. I really do enjoy these Brü A episodes as well, because I feel like our listeners aren't necessarily expecting us to feed them absolutes, but rather share what it is we do or what it is we do know, along with, experiences that we've had over the years, our thoughts, stuff like that. So that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. All right. If you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brülosophy over at patreon.com/Brülosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. We are really excited about the rewards for November. Patrons pledging at just $5 per month get 15% off all the fresh 2022 whole cone hops from Yakima Valley Hops that they can put their hands on, which can easily make up for the pledge amount. And our live Q&A guests for this month are none other than brewing podcast legends James Spencer and Steve Wilkes from Basic Brewing Radio. These guys have been doing their thing for almost as long as I've been brewing. Their podcast remains one of my favorites. I listen to it weekly. And that's all because of how great James and Steve are as people. If you're one of the 6 homebrewers out there who hasn't heard of Basic Brewing Radio, go check them out now. I'm sure you're going to love it just as much as we do. And then you can make your pledge of just $3 or more at patreon.com/Brülosophy in order to be a part of that session. You have to do that before Friday, November 18th, 2022, as the guys are going to be taking questions on Saturday the 19th. All past sessions are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. You can learn more about becoming a patron and check out all of the rewards we offer for your support over at patreon.com/Brülosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brülosophy.com/support when you're shopping online. Your experience doesn't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. With the holiday shopping season upon us, we would really appreciate you taking the time to use these links, as that helps us to cover the costs of running this show and the website. Finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a rating and review of this show in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, that'd be awesome as well. We are inching closer and closer to that 1,000 review mark, which ultimately means nothing, but it is kind of cool, makes us feel good that to know what you guys think. And that is an Apple Podcast. I know that there are other places where you can't leave reviews the same way you do in Apple Podcasts, so that's kind of what we focus the most on. But just wanted to let you all know that we appreciate those of you who have made or who have taken the time to leave those ratings and reviews. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've brewed on both their 120 and 240 volt systems, and I'm telling you, these things are legit, efficient, easy to use with a relatively small footprint. You will not be disappointed with one of these units. Plus, the guys behind the company run an awesome YouTube channel, which you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. If you're in the market for electric brewing gear or even just reasonably priced kettles and such, make sure to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer at clawhammersupply.com. And don't forget to let them know that Brülosophy sent you when you're checking out. That's clawhammersupply.com. Listener Simon Scheck wrote in with some thoughts after listening to us chat about brewing with hot and cold brew coffee in episode 257. Simon says, I rarely brew with adjuncts. I tend to have a, quote, caffeine before midday, alcohol after midday rule, so I don't usually mix the two, but I found this really interesting. I think the main difference between cold brew and hot brew coffee is the lack of bitterness and astringency in the cold brew. So I'm not that surprised there was no difference in the experiment beers where dark grains were used, and there would have been a decent bitterness and astringency anyways. I'd be much more interested to hear the same experiment with a pale beer where the cold brew might not really give the stout character, but something else unique. Similar to the Cold Steep Black IPA, which wasn't made with coffee, but similar intention that I brewed recently with fantastic results.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I guess Simon actually emailed me as a show suggestion to do this on the Brew Lab to see if I can get somebody on.
That'd be great.
To do an episode on this, and I'm working on that, Simon. I'm going to see if I can get somebody to talk about this cold steeping thing. It's interesting because I when I did that experiment, I preferred sort of the hot mashed dark grains, but it's interesting. That's one of those that I think, if you modulated some of the other factors, maybe it would make a difference. I mean, Gordon Strong, it was one of the people who really, sort of championed that as a way to increase those desirable flavors in that style of beer. And so it's one of those things. I'd love to see what is the science behind that. What's actually getting extracted? What are the extraction rates at warm versus cooler temperatures? Are you getting more bitterness or caffeine or something that's coming out at warmer temperatures? I mean, that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case for cold brew coffee, but who knows? But it's a really cool one and a really interesting question. I hate that my answer is I don't really know, but I'm really interested to look into it. And if I can get somebody to sign up to do a Brew Lab episode, then we'll have an episode on that.
Yeah, I totally get where Simon is coming from. Just like roasted coffee, roasted grains do have more bitterness and astringency. All you have to do is throw a couple kernels in your mouth next to pale malt, and you'll be able to tell that quickly. So that may easily have covered up any differences in those experiment beers. The thing is, it's fairly commonly claimed that darker beers made with cold brew coffee will be, quote, smoother, than the same beers made with hot brewed coffee. And that's why we tested that out. I too look forward to future, at least one future experiment, probably more, where we do the same comparison in a lighter beer style. I think Andy and I talked about that on that episode. It'll be fascinating to see if the cold brew, let's say, for example, a cold brew blonde ale is smoother in character than, say, the same beer made with a hot brewed coffee. Now, a little aside, I own the domain brewlosophy.com with BREW. Right now it redirects to Brewlosophy, but I've been toying with the idea. I'm not a huge coffee nerd, but I know there are plenty out there of doing basically Brewlosophy, like coffee version of Brewlosophy. We get so many questions that I have to ignore because I am in no way an expert on coffee about coffee brewing as well. And oddly enough, I think because I own that domain or whatever, I often get like advertisements for things coffee related as well. So yeah, I'm only half joking there, by the way, but I do think it's interesting. And we absolutely have more coffee experiments coming up down the line. So thank you so much for the feedback, Simon. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. When we return from this break, answers to your questions. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Exchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Exchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Exchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to exchillerator.com today. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Huge thanks to everybody who submitted questions. The list is pretty long, so if we don't get to your question today, chances are we will in a future Brü A episode, so hang tight. All right, first up, a question comes from Charles Eichert, who says, I've always passivated my stainless steel with Star San. However, scrolling the interwebs, I ran into a message board that stated phosphoric acid will not passivate stainless steel, even if used at 1 ounce per gallon. Instead, they recommend using a 4 to 10% ratio of citric acid to water. Now, here's where I'm scratching my head. Since water is fluid and citric acid is powder, is this ratio by weight or by volume? Water weighs 8.35 pounds per gallon. So for an 8-gallon fermenter, that's 8 times 8.35, which equals 66.8 pounds. For a 7% solution, that's 66.8 times 0.07, which would be 4.676 pounds of citric acid. Is my math correct? Do I need almost 5 pounds of citric acid to passivate an 8-gallon fermenter, or am I out in left field?
That's a tough one. The math there, I think, is right. I'm pretty sure it's right. I played around with this one. Well, actually, let me start at a different place. So I spent way too much time trying to answer this question, and that's mostly because I know next to nothing about passivation. And in my opinion, a really great person to ask this question of would be John Palmer.
That's right. Yeah.
He would probably be able to answer this question way better and in way more detail than I can. But I did do I got my Google PhD in it real quick. It just like looking around, and what I understand is so passivation. For ASTM industry standards, they do suggest using nitric or citric acid. You're probably only going to be able to get access to citric acid for passivation. But the point of passivation is to remove iron deposits from the surface of the kettle. So essentially, as I understand it, when you're brewing, you're adding like iron gets, attached to the surface of the kettle, and that iron, when it's exposed to oxygen, can cause rust and can essentially, degrade or cause pitting and corrosion and essentially degrade your stainless steel, right? And so the point of passivating is to use a chemical that reacts with iron, usually, like, for example, citric acid, that reacts with iron so that it removes the iron, and then whenever all the iron's gone and the kettle is left to dry, there's this oxide layer that forms that prevents, or that helps the kettle in terms of longevity. So that's my sort of 30-minute understanding of what passivation is. And my comment on this is ASTM definitely says citric acid. I couldn't find anywhere that it says yeah, absolutely, you can use Star San for passivating a kettle. But I have a personal experience with this, and I think a lot of people have. When I've brewed with if I've brewed a sour beer, or for example, if I've just left some equipment sitting in Star San, it generally always comes out cleaner, right? I had some situations where I've got an electric system, and I had a situation where I accidentally scorched one of the burners, one of the elements, the heating elements. I was mad about it, and so I just dropped it in my bucket of Star San, and I left it there during the entire brew day for 6 or 7 hours. And when I came back to it, a lot of the scorching was gone.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And
yeah.
I was shocked about that. I was like, oh, well, this is weird. I didn't realize that Star San has this had a cleaning ability. But then I started thinking about it. I've done this before in other things. For example, I dropped an old rusty wrench in the bottom of a Star San bucket, and I didn't feel like getting it out, so I just left it there. And whenever I pulled it out, it was like brand new stainless steel. So something here is working with Star San, at least in my own personal experience. But honestly, that's probably as far as I can go into help on this, because I don't understand exactly what's going on and why passivation works. All I know is that anecdotally, I've seen Star San do what it seems like you would do when you're trying to passivate a kettle. Does that make sense?
So first off, I am right there with you. I am by no means a metallurgist like John Palmer is, but this is one of those topics that I have spoken with John about in the past because of issues that I was having with off flavors in beer that I'm saying, hey, why is there this weird white layer of stuff on my fermentation vessel? And the first thing he said was, did you passivate it? That characteristic that you're describing, this flavor character, it was a very odd, dull, kind of dulling experience experience on the palate. It's really difficult to explain. And apparently my use of just Star San, which I thought, all I did is I took my Star San spray bottle, sprayed it over my brand new stainless fermentation vessel, let it sit until it dried, and then I thought it was passivated. And apparently that wasn't good enough. So here's what I'll say. Again, first off, your math is right. And I will say, Charles, that this is one of those areas where using metric actually is much less confusing than imperial measurements, even though I'm cool with both, since grams are the same thing as milliliters. So it's a lot easier to calculate that way. But I did all of those calculations in metric, and you're right. To get where you need to be, 4.6 pounds is what I'm coming up with. So your math isn't off there. But what I will say is this: I used to do the Star San soak or the Star San spray on there and let it do that, and I would just tell myself it's passivated. And I'll admit, in the beginning when I first started using stainless fermentation vessels, I just kind of thought, even if it's not really passivated, probably not going to notice anything. Well, that wasn't the case with me. There was this, like I said, this weird visible white layer of something that formed on the surface of my stainless. And apparently, and I'm not going to say exactly what it is that John told me or what I recall because I don't totally remember. So this is mostly my anecdote here. But in order for me to get that white stuff off, which was the sign of a poorly passivated stainless, I got Barkeeper's Friend, which is a wonderful cleaning tool to have in your house for everything, but especially for brewing gear. It relies on, I think it's called oxalic acid. So it is an acid-based cleaner that cleans stainless incredibly well. A lot of elbow grease. I got every last, inch of the inside of my stainless fermentation vessel clean. And from that point forward, it never developed that white layer. The off flavor went away, and I went and did a little bit of Googling, and sure enough, Barkeeper's Friend seems to be a really, reliable way to passivate stainless steel. So I didn't even know that. I was just using it to clean it because I knew that it was safe for stainless. Lo and behold, it actually did the passivation that I was looking for anyway. So all you have to do is create a paste of this stuff. It's kind of like, it looks like Comet. Comes in the same type of a container as like Comet. You make a really thick paste, spread it all over your surface, scrub really well, kind of leave it on there for 15, 20 minutes and then rinse it off. And that should do the trick. So that's what I'm recommending, Charles, because of my own anecdotal experience and some stuff that I've heard from other people that I trust out there. But I would not be wasting the money on, 4.6 pounds of citric acid and 8 gallons of water if it were me.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, same. I think I'm in the same boat, and I think I'll probably leave that right there. I don't think I have anything else to add. I think that's a good one. So our next question comes from Jedediah Allen, and he says, I'm an aspiring small-scale commercial brewer and haven't even started the process yet. I was brainstorming about how, where, when to open a brewery and thought of possibly doing so in a converted food truck. I know space will be at a premium with all the equipment, but I believe it could be a novel way to get started until I can afford to expand. What are your thoughts about this?
I like questions like this because they are seeking just our opinions. And so that is, I'm going to qualify my response now is that this is just my opinion. I can't see, knowing people who run food trucks, not beer food trucks, but actual food trucks, I can't see how that would be profitable in the slightest. I mean, the beer markup at this point, with the cost of goods and everything that goes into brewing it, in terms of your energy source, all of that, I just can't see how that would be very profitable if you're brewing on a small scale. Now, if you have some way, and I'm presuming that you're paying paying off your food truck or whatever it might be. If you own all that stuff outright, then maybe it would be. But then there are other things you have to keep in mind. There's no amount of driving that's not going to shake up your kegs of beer. And so you're going to have settling time. You're going to want to make sure that you're minding all of your cold side oxidation stuff because that shaking could potentially bring more oxygen, introduce more oxygen if you're fermenting in this food truck. It seems like a really difficult approach. Now, I do have a local friend, Oscar, who he may still be planning on doing something along those lines, but I don't think he was doing it necessarily as a business opportunity, just more so as like something fun to travel around and serve beer to friends and such. But it just seems like a really difficult business plan, a really difficult approach to serving quality beer in that way. But maybe I'm missing something, Cade.
Well, yeah, so that's actually how I was thinking of it. Like what you were talking about with your friend. I was thinking, like, how cool would that be to just like roll up to somebody's house with your brewing equipment?
Totally.
you know, and just be like, hey, yeah, let's brew. Don't worry, I'll bring the equipment to you. You know, that'd be really cool. You know, there's a couple of things that I think about. I mean, it would be, I think, first of all, if you could pull this off, I think there's definitely opportunity to sell beer at food truck courts, right?
Totally.
Or places that food trucks are at. I mean, I think there's a lot of people that would like to buy beer there. This is evidenced by, there's a really cool local spot here in Corvallis called Common Fields, which is basically just a bar with a food truck court outside of it, which is really cool. And so, yeah, I mean, people go there and have dinner and food and beer and all that stuff, and it's a great place. So I think that's kind of a cool idea if you can make it work. There's another part of this that maybe stems from my legal background a little bit. It's going to be real tricky navigating the alcohol laws in your country or state.
Yeah.
Because if you've noticed, there's always signs that say no liquor beyond this point. Well, unless you're in New Orleans and then they just don't give a crap. But, there's always usually signs that say no alcohol beyond this point, right? And I think I said liquor, but I meant to say alcohol. No alcohol beyond this point. And so if you're moving your brewery around, you're changing the physical location of where you're serving alcohol. And my guess is you're going to be under very different restrictions depending on where you move it. And also my guess is your local alcohol agency, like if you're in a state here in the United States, for example, they're probably not going to be okay with you moving your brewery around and serving people, right? So that's probably going to be an issue. If you could find a place that you could brew at, like, for example, a Common Fields, if you could find a place where you just roll the trailer in there, park it, right, and don't ever move it, and just serve beer out of that truck, that might be kind of cool, right? I mean, that'd be kind of a cool way to go about it. And if you did that, one other last piece of feedback that I would do is I think I'd try to stick to an electric system. I wouldn't want propane or gas going on anywhere near a food truck or other people who are trying to cook or drink or eat. Any of those things. So I'd try to stick to one of those electric systems. But hey, if you actually figure out a way to pull this off, I mean, all the power to you. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, that was going to be my final point as well. Is the licensing is probably going to be really difficult. I mean, open container laws, where you can serve, and then selling that beer. They want to know that there's a place that beer is being sold from. Now, here's the thing. I've seen online, like pictures on Facebook and such, of what seem to be food trucks with like taps on the side, so like they're not impossible. And it may be, I was out camping one time. I thought this was pretty cool. And so we have a travel trailer that we go camping in all the time. And there was this person a few camp spots down from us who had a faucet on the side of their trailer. Would not be difficult to do.
Nice.
Pretty cool. And it was there mostly just to be kind of quirky and fun. He put just a commercial keg in a garbage can with ice, but it was really neat. So, like I could see, as somebody who has a trailer and who is going to breweries that have food trucks all the time, I can see the marriage of those two ideas as being kind of a fun idea and potentially working out. I just think the logistics behind one, moving that amount of beer, the amount that you would need to actually make a profit with all of the brewing and everything that you're moving around, that heavy amount of equipment's going to cost more in gas. I mean, we know how much that costs. That plus the licensing stuff, legal stuff, I just think is going to make that a little bit difficult. But Jedediah, if you do it, man, let us know, because I would love to, I'd love to see pictures and hear more about your story. I think it's a pretty neat idea. So, all right, next question comes from Jeremy Hunter, who's also a patron of Brewlosophy. He's from the UK. Jeremy says, my experience with making cider has taught me the difference between a strongly acidic and a highly acidic drink. Something can have an appropriate pH but low acidity because it's only a small amount of strong acid, or because it's entirely acid, just a weak one. Both have the same impact on pH, but a completely different impact on flavor and character generally. I live in a hard water area, so if I want to develop my water profile, I have to add acid to reduce the pH, but how much acid is too much acid to impact the end beer? I'm sure this will depend on the style, but am I generally better off reducing the pH quickly with a small amount of strong acid, or using more of a weaker acid? Now, just real quick, this to me sounds like a question that's going to involve things like titratable acidity, which I am by no means an expert at. I don't brew very much sour beer, but this is an interesting question and one that I've thought about before on my own.
Yeah. Same for me. And I think if I can understand the question here, what he means in terms of like strong acid or weak acid, I don't think he means like the chemical definition there. I think what he's saying is like one that has a strong flavor or a weak flavor, is sort of how I read that question. Maybe I'm wrong, because to me, like a strong acid and a weak acid just means the ability to dissociate, like how quickly it dissociates and changes the pH.
Sure.
Right. And that's just a function of a chemical property. But there can be differences in perception, right? Like I've used, for example, I had hard water here. I had it in Austin. I've used 88% lactic. I've used 85% phosphoric. I've used 10% phosphoric, which is just basically a change in the concentration of the solution. And I've used all of those for pH adjustment. And it, what's different, or well, I guess I would say what's important about the strength there is just you can use any calculator to figure out how much you need to change the pH. But I think the type of acid can make a huge difference in flavor. Like brown sugar is a one that I commonly smell whenever I think of lactic acid. A more neutral flavor from phosphoric, but still sort of this acidic flavor. And it's pretty interesting. I mean, we've done a couple of experiments on lactic versus phosphoric, which I'm sure you were going to touch on, Marshall.
That is absolutely what I was going to touch on.
Yeah.
But to go along real quick with what you were saying, the way I read Jeremy's question was more about concentration. So, I'm thinking you've got 10% phosphoric or 88% phosphoric, for example. And are you going to get a different characteristic, a different flavor if you use one over the other to achieve the same pH? We may be interpreting this question wrong. I do not know. But I will say that like you presumed, Cade, the experiments that we've done on mash pH. Now, this is mash pH. We know that grains and the mash in general offer massive amounts of buffering capacity. So you can start with water that has a certain pH, and the mash is going to bring it well within the range for the most part, right? Depending on what grains you're using and such, that it will likely bring it in within at least an acceptable range, for conversion to occur. We've done two experiments, one where we overly acidified the starting brewing water, which led to a lower mash pH versus a, quote, normal mash pH. And we've done the opposite, where I used a bunch of pickling lime to increase the mash pH and left the other ones standard. And in both of those, the beers were imperceptible. There were very little perceptible differences. And the brewers, Jake and myself, we just could not tell these beers apart, taste any differences. So, I get that when we're dealing with cider, it's a little bit different because you're not going through that mashing process. And so perhaps, shifts in pH can be more perceptible. I'm just not entirely convinced. And I guess that's my excuse for not providing a better response to this question. I'm just not entirely convinced that mash pH has much of a sensory impact as it might on the more objective things like overall conversion, or perhaps even things like attenuation. And so that's not something that I would necessarily worry about. I would focus more, or I guess I do focus more on the mineral profile of the water these days than I do pH of the water.
Yeah, for sure, Jerry. And Jeremy, I'm sorry if we're sort of misunderstanding your question. I'm not exactly sure what we're trying to get at. But again, there are also, I've done an experiment on like lactic versus phosphoric, just like straight.
Yeah.
Those different ones. So yeah, and in one, I think I can't remember who it was. Maybe it was Malcolm who did the other one. But tasters could tell on one when we did a lactic versus phosphoric comparison, but not on the other.
Yeah.
And I've heard some anecdotes from brewers that definitely prefer one of the acids. Like some brewers will say, I only use lactic because I don't like the flavor that phosphoric gives. But in terms of like, will there be a flavor difference between 85% phosphoric versus 10% phosphoric? I don't know that that's going to make much of a difference.
Right.
Except for whatever that other 15% or 90% is,
Yeah.
right? Like that may make more of a flavor difference than the actual contribution of the phosphoric, but who knows? And it could be different in cider as well. All right, so next question is from Terry Jeffress from Salt Lake City, Utah. And he says, I have a question about keg carbonation. Many of your experiment articles have a statement like, I burst carbonated at 40 psi for 24 hours, then reduced the pressure to 12 psi for 6 days of conditioning before the beers were ready to serve to participants. And then, so that was a quote. And I think I've definitely written that sentence a number of times.
Likewise.
Yeah. So he says, wouldn't putting the beer on 12 12 psi of pressure for 7 days end up with the same result, carbonated beer. I can't seem to find any literature that comments on the benefit of getting a beer fully carbonated fast. If you're going to wait a week before serving the beer, then why not just use the set it and forget it method?
Good question, Terry. Here's why. We're impatient, and usually we want to start drinking our beer sooner than when we're serving it to tasters. The way that, I mean, it's easy to kind of not recognize or understand this side of it, but when we brew these beers that we're serving to tasters, the beers may be done, and the time between when we keg it and when we serve it to tasters, we're always sure to make that very clear. Whether it's 6 weeks or 7 days or 10 days or whatever it might be, because we feel like that may, contribute to some factor, in the findings, whatever it may be. But we want to drink these beers as well. And usually we like to do our personal evaluations prior to serving the beers to the tasters. And so by burst carbonating, usually if you're doing it, at least the way that I do it, and you're kegging clear beer and all of that stuff, you can start drinking within 24 hours. That may be on a Tuesday evening. We're not going out and getting tasters on a Tuesday evening. We are often waiting for brew club meetings or a weekend, early afternoon on a weekend before people at the local brewery have started to get sloshed, so we can catch them as they're coming in. And so the time, it's more it's weird because the timing of that comment, of that statement, is really based on the timing of when we're collecting data and not necessarily the timing of when or how we're going about carbonating the beer. You can absolutely leave your beer at 12 psi. It's going to take longer than 7 days in my experience to get it to the carbonation level that you want. To me, 12 psi, you're looking at 2 weeks minimum. And then you could ask, well, why don't you just, keg condition? Why don't you just naturally condition those? Because it's taken the same amount of time. I don't want to. I'm impatient. But the beauty of kegging, besides the fact that you're only, racking beer to one vessel as opposed to 50, the beauty is that you have control over when that beer is ready. And that's what I love about burst carbonation so much. And there are people out there who will swear that the beer gets, even if you burst carbonate, that the carbonation quality improves after 3 or 4 days. I don't notice that. To me, it's carbonated. The beer's good, especially if it's clear, which I make sure that I only keg clear beer or beer that's ready to drink. It just needs a little carbonation. And I love that. So that's the reason for that.
Yeah, exactly. And I was going to say exactly the same thing, right? Unless the variable calls for some sort of conditioning, right? Unless the conditioning is important to the variable, I'm usually just trying to get the beer finished and ready to serve.
Yeah.
Right. So I would say it's less often I'm putting the beer in a keg and then waiting for it to condition before serving to tasters. And more often, okay, I put the beer in the keg, it's ready to go. And the first time I served it to tasters was 4 days or 7 days or 10 days later.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
It's less about the making that decision up front. And that is just kind of the mechanics of doing it. And like you said, Marshall, it's usually 2 weeks or more before it gets there on the set it and forget it method.
Yeah.
And again, the thing about set it and forget it is you can just set it and forget about it for 2 weeks and then serve. But I want to be ready to serve, right? I don't want to be thinking about the beer and checking it every day to go okay, is it carbonated? Can I serve it now? Okay, is it ready? Can I serve it now? I just want to be done so that I know, okay, at the first opportunity I have to serve to tasters, I can go ahead and do that. And that's why I do it. On the mechanics of carbonation, you're putting a high concentration of CO2 into the top of the keg, right? So eventually it'll mix into the beer and homogenize. It's just a matter of the speed in which you want to do that, right? So if you're just force carbonating the beer, whether you do it at 40 psi for 24 hours or 12 psi for whatever amount of time gets you the same carbonation level, it's doing the same thing. You're just doing it in a shorter period of time. At least that's my understanding. And so that's the bottom line for me. It's faster, and I can serve it to tasters earlier, and I can drink it earlier.
That's the key for me, is that I want to drink it earlier, because we're not drinking these beers while we're waiting to collect data. We just we've got to save enough beer so that there's enough to collect the data. But we're impatient brewers who want to drink these beers as soon as possible. So next question comes from Tony Leon from Connecticut. He says, if in a lot of your episodes you reference ppm, parts per million, I would love to hear you break down the definition or an easy way to determine ppm ratios. I constantly hear how water profiles can really improve your brews, and while I've dabbled a bit with brewing salts, mainly calcium chloride and gypsum, I'd like to dial in how to determine ppm better. This way I can get my water profile to match the particular style I plan on brewing.
Cool. Yeah. Like you said, Tony, ppm means parts per million. So the technical definition is the weight of the compound that's added to 1 unit volume of water to give 1 part of the compound per million parts of the solution. Okay. So that's a technical definition, but here's the really easy way to think about it. And I'm going to use metric units because imperial units are silly. But ppm is milligrams per liter.
Yep.
Milligrams per liter. There's 1,000 milligrams in a gram, and there's 1,000 milliliters in a liter. So 1,000 times 1,000 is 1 million. All right. So 1 milligram per liter is 1 part compound per 1 million parts of substance. Okay. 1 milligram per liter is 1 part in a million, 1 part per million. That's kind of the easiest way that I can describe it in terms of making it simple. And when you're doing water ratios, I would encourage you to do it in imperial units. It gets super confused. Or I'm sorry, do it in metric units. Yeah. Metric. Don't use imperial. God, if you use metric units, if you use imperial, it gets really complicated and silly. You have to do stupid conversions like pounds per gallon, which gives you like really tiny numbers. Let's say you want 100 parts per million. That's really easy, right? That's 100 milligrams of stuff that you have to weigh out. So 0.1 grams. It's really easy to figure out if you do it in metric. If you do that in imperial, to get a pound per gallon, it's 8.4 times 10 to the negative 4 pounds per gallon. So you have to weigh out 0.00084 pounds of the substance to get it, and that's just silly, right?
Silly.
I mean, it's just don't hurt yourself that way. And also, I would say, since you're starting to dabble into water chemistry, I always recommend that you start and save yourself some trouble by using a calculator like Brü Water or Brewfather, which you put in all this information and then it spits out a number of grams that you need to use. And Brü Water, especially, when you open up that Excel sheet, it has mounds of data that you can read through, right? Explanations for what each thing does, what parts per million means, all of this stuff. So I think those are really, really good resources that I would encourage you to check out.
Yeah, so there's nothing that you said, Cade, that I can really add to it. It's like our notes on this question were exactly the same.
You're right. Yeah.
Parts per million, Tony, is not imperial or metric. It is just a measurement. That's
exactly. Yeah.
And so don't confuse yourself with that. Milligrams per liter is one of the. I remember when I was looking, somebody was making a recommendation for this and this milligrams per liter, and I'm like, boy, that's going to take me forever to figure this out. When I realized it's the same exact thing as parts per million, it really simplified a lot of stuff for me. Now, what I will say is, Tony, the best thing that you can do is know your water profile. So if you are starting with, for example, store-bought RO, you know that that's basically going to be 0 across the board. Same with distilled water. If you're using your home water, you have to know where you're starting at, and there are various ways to figure that out. This is not an advertisement, but I would love for Ward Labs to sponsor us. But go to Ward Labs. They do really awesome work. They realized a few years ago that homebrewers were a big part of who was going to them to determine their water profiles, and so they created a brewer's package where they will run all of a test that will spit out all of the levels that we are concerned with as brewers. You send your water in there, do it the proper way, you get your water profile back, and then you can plug that into something like Brewfather, into their water calculator. It will save your profile, and then you can go and select what you want based on the style of beer you're making, and it'll spit out, it'll give you very specific numbers in terms of grams of how much of each salt to add so that you can get this water profile that you want. Don't do it paper and pencil. You're gonna annoy the crap out of yourself. Use a quality water profile calculator. There's Brü Water by Martin Brungard. There's Brewfather obviously has it. That's what we use. There's Beersmith has their water profile calculator. Rely on those. You're probably already using a calculator to design your recipes anyways. Use the water function on that, and I think you'll see that it really can have a big impact if you're doing it properly. So, well, that brings us to the end of this segment. We've got to take a short break. We will be right back with more Brü A after these messages. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brulosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. Alrighty, time to answer another batch of listener-submitted questions. Cade, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, so Corey B. wrote in and he said, a lot of people have been asking about cold side oxidation, and I heard an interesting thought that I can't get out of my head from the first time I started kegging. Mind you, it was without closed transfers. He says, after sanitizing the keg with Star San, I'm left with a ton of foam. I'm curious if you transfer to a keg by using a gravity system and the tubing is always below the Star San foam, could that layer of foam protect from cold side oxidation until you purge the keg to carbonate? Or is there too much oxygen in the bubbles of the foam for it to be a viable theory?
Okay, so we haven't tested this out, so we can't speak to this with much authority. At least I can't. But yes, my first thought would be that the stuff that's filling those bubbles is oxygen, the very oxygen that you're hoping to avoid by doing pressurized transfers and purging your keg and all of that. So I don't see that as being a viable theory, right? In terms of keeping your tubing underneath the foam. That being said, purely anecdote, I spent the better part of my kegging life up until about 3 years ago, not transferring beer into purged kegs, keeping the lid off, not doing pressurized transfers. And I made beers that were winning awards. I made beers that I thought tasted good. These days I wouldn't do that with any beer style. But back in the day, what I started to kind of realize is that maybe there are certain styles of beer that just seem to be more sensitive to oxygen than others. Hoppy beers, namely, being what I think gets most focused these days. And that has turned out to be pretty true, at least anecdotally speaking, in the beers that I've made where we've tested things out and such. So, it could be that you rack your a Pilsner or a Blonde Ale or something underneath the Star San foam. It doesn't get too oxidized. The beer still tastes good. Don't let that, be the determining factor for you to convince yourself that Star San foam protected your beer. It may be some other factor as well. I guess that's the point that I'm trying to make. The other thing is if you have a kegging setup, purging your keg and racking beer into it isn't that much more difficult, and there are various ways to go about doing it. I would just recommend playing it safe and trying to avoid cold side oxidation as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and there's a really easy way to do it, right? If you've got all of the kegging equipment already set up, it's really easy to do exactly what you and I do whenever we fill up our kegs through closed transfer systems. We fill it up all the way with sanitizer solution. That means there's very few bubbles and very little foam, and then you push it out with CO2 until all of that liquid is blown out of the keg. So whatever bubbles are remaining in the keg should be CO2 bubbles, not air bubbles, right?
Yeah.
And you can do that with a gravity gravity system. You just, again, push all the liquid out and then just depressurize not necessarily depressurize the keg, but you put something to depress the poppet as you're putting beer into the keg, right? Beer goes in the liquid side, and you've got something holding open the gas side, or if you've got ball lock kegs, you're constantly burping it so that the beer continues to go in, and that'll just continue positive pressure pushing CO2 out so no air gets in. That's the easy way to fill the keg where you don't have to worry about bubbles or anything like that. Yeah. On the bubbles comment, though, I think it's like foam in beer or foam on Krausen or something, or during fermentation, or like when we say cap on foam, that's not like the foam itself isn't what's protecting the beer. Oxygen can make its way through the foam, right? And sometimes it gets bound up by the foam, but sometimes it also makes it into the beer. We say foam on beer because it's CO2 that's pushing out of solution, right? CO2 is coming out, and that's what's creating, positive pressure that's kind of like not necessarily pushing oxygen out. It's not really fair to say that, but it's creating that matrix that oxygen can sometimes get trapped in, but it's still going to make it all the way through.
Yeah.
But like you said with Star Sand foam, I'm pretty sure that's mostly air. I don't think that's anything, like CO2 or anything like that would be safe. So when that foam is trapped in there, it's going to get, into solution. Now, all that being said, I did a test, right, with Star Sand foam, and we found out that it wasn't over oxygenated. That whatever oxygen was trapped in that Star Sand foam wasn't enough to cause issues with the beer. So, take that with a grain of salt, knowing that other experiments need to be done, but that's anyway, a starting point.
Yeah. And just before we move on to the next question, this is completely, do not make anything of this, but I do think it's an interesting experience that Ray found. Again, OG contributor of Brülosophy. He started to wonder, he was messing around with some stuff, and he had some Star Sand left in a glass that he put some beer in, and he noticed I think he was using it as like the pour off of his Keyser or something, but he noticed that when he mixed that beer with just a little bit of Star Sand that he had in the glass, it seemed, and he left it out, it seemed to oxidize faster than beers that went into glasses that did not have the Star Sand in there. And so he started to wonder if maybe there's some sort of that Star Sand kind of expedites the staling process when left at room temperature. We don't know. Again, like you said, Cade, you did the experiment. It didn't seem to have much of an impact at all, if any. But there are some ideas. I started doing some Googling about that, the impact that Star Sand has on cold side oxidation. There are some other people out there who seem to kind of have the same idea, but I could not find any really solid research indicating that it does have that negative impact. But just something interesting to think about. So, all right, next question comes from Duke Osterberry. He says, I mostly brew low gravity beer, and I've noticed that hoppier styles like German Pils and Session IPA get wonderful head formation and have excellent retention, whereas my more delicately hopped beers have crummy head, specifically when I use high alpha hops. My last Belgian wit had a tiny amount of Magnum for bittering and a whisper of Saats at flameout. Even with 20% wheat, the head dropped almost immediately, even in freshly washed glasses. An 8.2% triple with similar hopping had the same issue. I know Dr. Bamforth notes hops as foam positive and alcohol as foam negative. Could the problem be the super high alpha hops that are added in small amounts for bittering on low IBU beers? Have you ever seen this? Even in my cream ale that's made with a higher amount of low alpha hops and 20% flaked corn, there's better head retention than my wit and triple. Low IBU through a small bittering charge of Magnum seems to be the only driving force. There's nothing more enjoyable than finishing a pint and having all that sticky lacing left over. This isn't all of my beers, so my knee-jerk reaction is that it's recipe-based rather than process. I'm going to test this out by brewing low IBU beers with more low alpha hops earlier in the boil rather than less high alpha hops. If I need a considerably higher IBU, I'll probably cut the Magnum with a lower alpha variety to increase the total hops used for bittering. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, Duke, I love your questions. They're always so thoughtful. There's a lot going on in here and a lot to answer. You sort of answered your own question a little bit in that you mentioned high hopping rates generally improve foam and head retention. And that's generally true. Hops are foam positive, meaning they increase the foam, and the head retention, right? The size of the foam and also its retention. CO2 concentration will also impact foam because CO2 coming out of solution will create the bubble network that's going on up there. But what's interesting is the part of hops that creates foam is isoalpha acids, or not it's not the only thing. This is an oversimplification. This is probably the most important thing from hops that leads to foam retention. So beers with higher ISOs, higher IBUs, have better head retention. That's like, think about any of those big, West Coast IPAs that are really bitter and have really good head retention. There's a lot of bitterness and IBUs in those. So you said you're making low IBU beers here, or that you're seeing this in low IBU beers. So that could be part of the issue, that there's just not enough IBUs in there to improve head retention. Alcohol can also be a problem too, and it also sort of depends on the underlying protein. I mean, there's organic acids, and pH will always change things. There's a lot of things that impact foam. And I was on a recent Brew Lab episode where we talked about foam with Dr. Evan Evans. And one of the things that he mentioned to me is that foam is not static. It's this like roiling matrix. So like things are constantly changing inside foam. And all of these factors play a role. If you're trying to improve foam in low alpha beers, if you can get your hands on, I think it's Tetra or Row, and maybe not Row, but it's one of those other bitterness components, you can add those and they can increase your foam and head retention. So that might be an option for low IBU and low alcohol beers, is to use an alternative hop product. I'd be really interested to see what your test results were, where you used like more low alpha hops rather than less high alpha hops, because again, the key component is those iso alpha acids that get into solution. So I would think if you're getting the same amount of iso alpha acids into solution, they shouldn't really impact your head retention. But I'd really be interested to see what you get from that. But like always, thanks again. This is a really thoughtful question. I think there's a lot going on here, and a lot of ways to play with this to try to improve head retention.
Yeah, I don't have a good response to you, Duke. This is one of those questions where I've actually experienced kind of similar things that you are, but in the opposite. There was one beer that I made, kind of an interesting story. It was a Kolsch that had, I think, 10 or 15% wheat malt, and then the rest just like Pilsner malt or whatever. I made this Kolsch, and when I would pour it, just like every other beer, I didn't do anything different. Made the recipe just like I would normally, poured it off the tap, and it was almost like when you pour a soda off of a soda tap or whatever, and the bubbles just immediately fall, right? And that's exactly what happened with this Kolsch. It blew my mind. I thought maybe it's a dirty glass, so I went and I got a new glass. It did it for every time I poured it. Otherwise, delicious beer. The Kolsch was great. I had friends come over who are experienced in brewing. They looked at the recipe. They listened to my process. They couldn't explain what the heck was going on. Every other beer that I would make, whether it was high IBU, low IBU, if I was using high alpha ops, whatever, I've always had good head retention. But this one Kolsch, for some reason, was the issue. A couple months later, I come back, I make the same exact recipe, hoping that the foam retention is going to be different, and it was exactly the same. The only thing that I chalked it up to, I hit the internet. I'm starting to look at like, what is going on here? There are quite a few anecdotal reports of people adding wheat malt to lower hopped beers and thinking that that's going to be good for head retention, when ultimately it actually seems, again, no proof here, but it kind of seems to have the opposite effect than what we'd expect from this, higher protein wheat malt. And I couldn't help but wondering, maybe that's the case. Maybe there's something about adding wheat malt with that lower hopping rate that may, have kind of a foam negative thing going on with beer. I don't know. But when I make IPA, when I'm making, higher alcohol, those seem to be the ones that I get the best foam on, regardless of the hopping that I go for with it. So, again, Duke, I really don't know. I think it's an interesting question, and I'm sure Charlie Bamforth would have a much better answer than I do, but
Yeah, the Pope of Foam would definitely know better, better than we would. And I know he's written books and papers on it too, so it'd be really interesting to see. But again, I think the big takeaway from all of that is that there are a lot of things that impact foam. It's not just one thing, right? So it's hard to say that like just one thing is going to improve, or like it's all related to just the hop, the concentration of alpha acids in a hop that you're using. So anyway. Yeah, you think about carapils. I mean,
for decades, people were using carapils thinking that it was contributing to foam, head retention, all that stuff. And come to find out, based on, I think some of Charlie's research, it's a foam negative grain, right? So it's just kind of interesting, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And there's this whole thing. I mean, there's also, yeasts that are foam positive and foam negative, right? I mean, I did an episode with Laura Burns talking about yeast colloidal haze. And that was one of the things, like yeast themselves have an impact too. So maybe the yeast strain that you're using is also causing it. Anyway, I think we need to leave foam there because we can, like I said, we can brainstorm a lot of things, but it really is just going to come down to you trying different things in your process too. So again, thanks for the question. And the next one is from Jake Swinson from Richmond, Virginia. And he says, this may sound ridiculous, but would you ever consider using rainwater for brewing? We have several rain barrels that collect tons of chlorine-free water after a storm. If the water was collected, filtered, and boiled, I'm wondering if it would work in something like an IPA or a cider.
Absolutely. My biggest concern with where I live in Central Valley of California would be what else is coming down with that rain, right? we have a lot of smog here during the summertime. So that would be, I know people who brew with rainwater. So that is a common, I mean, I don't know if it's common, but it is done. What I would do is I'd take a sample of that rainwater and I would send it in, and then I would do everything I could to treat it to ensure that it was safe to drink, that there weren't, any weird stuff in there. There's a ton of things that could be in there. And then I would make up a 1 gallon batch and see how it turns out. I mean, that's what I would do. And if I like it, then I've got the mineral profile, which I'm assuming wouldn't be too much, though, who knows? And then so you have a starting point for adjusting your mineral profile, and then brew up a batch so you know how it's going to play out in a beer. And I think that's a killer idea and one way to conserve water.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something I've considered before. And like, to echo you, Marshall, definitely have it tested, right? That's the easiest way to know if you can brew with it, is send it off to somebody like Ward Labs or wherever, and get it tested. And when I say get it tested, I mean, get it tested not just for brewing, but get it tested for all of the harmful things that might be present in there. I mean, if you're collecting rainwater like I would be at my house, like all that water is coming off of my asphalt roof, and then getting put in there. So I don't know what's coming out. You mentioned if you collected it, filtered it, and boiled, would it work? And I would sort of have a question back too, is can you assume that filtering and boiling is enough, right? Or that's going to get rid of any of these products, right? Yeah. If you boil it, is our asphalt products going to come out? Are they going to filter out? And the only way to test that is just to have your water tested by somebody that knows more about it than we do. So again, I'd echo Marshall in that way. It's like, yeah, I mean, it sounds great if you can get it to work and you can get enough water to be able to brew. There's lots of places that don't have enough rain for that to be a consistent source for brewing. But yeah, if you're able to do that and able to get it tested and it comes out clean, then yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I live in one of those places. I could have collected all of the rainwater over the last 12 months, and I think I might be able to brew a half-gallon batch with it. So, but
exactly.
But there are, I just want to make a point. There are water test kits that you can buy at like More Beer. I think Lamont makes one of the popular ones. I would, if you're going to use rainwater, I would just spend the $30 extra and send it off, because then you can get a test for carcinogens and stuff like that, just to make sure. I mean, I don't know. Some people are more risky. You can open your mouth and let rain fall into it. It's not going to kill you. We know that, but you're making beer. You want that beer to be as good as possible. So,
well, yeah. And there's opening your mouth outside, letting rain fall into it. And then there's drinking it as it drips off of the roof. Yeah. So, I mean, that's, to each his own. But again, that is the key, right? If you use Lamont or one of the More Beer kits or any of that stuff, that's just going to be testing for brewing minerals. It's not going to be testing water safety.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I think that's the key there. Spend the extra money and get it safety tested.
Yeah. All right. Next question comes from Stig Johansson from Norway. Stig says, I brewed a pretty heavy imperial stout with an OG of 1090, 1.090. That's a hefty one. It was fermented with WLP 007. That's the Whitbread dry strain, same as Imperial Yeast A01 House, and helped by Ultra Firm. After a few days, the beer was fed about 3 kilograms, which is about 6.5 pounds of Demerara sugar, split over several days with some extra help from EC 1118 champagne yeast. The The total gravity was estimated to be around 1.130. Everything fermented out nicely, and the beer reached 1025 FG for an estimated strength of about 16 to 18% ABV. After performing a cold crash and adding some strong coffee, the beer was transferred to a purged keg where I added oak cubes and had soaked in rum for a couple of weeks. The keg was then put in my keezer on 15 psi to carbonate. I left it like this for a few weeks before trying a sample, and to my dismay, the beer was more or less flat. It had absolutely no carbonation. So I upped the pressure to 30 psi and left it for another week before trying it again, and while I feared an overcarbonated mess, it was still flat. So I added even more pressure and let it sit at 50 psi for 2 weeks. Yet the beer still did not carbonate at all. All of my standard strength beers carbonate just fine, but the stout is not having any of it. The beer shoots out of the spout, so the pressure is definitely real, but all I get is thick, black, sweet beer with zero fizz, lots of heat, and awesome flavors. What in the world is going on here? My theory is that the beers with beers with either very high alcohol content or high FG are harder to carbonate due to the viscosity or some other property they possess, but I have no idea. Do you guys have any idea what's going on here?
So I have a guess. I'm not sure that this is actually true, but you know, one thing I want to say off the top, right? If you held the beer at 50 psi for 2 weeks, there's definitely CO2.
100%. Yeah.
Okay. So the beer is carbonated. I think what you're talking about when you're saying carbonation is like foam and the fizz, right? You keep talking about like the fizz and that you get from carbonation, and that's bubbles, right? I mean, bubbles, the bubble mouthfeel, the fizz, that carbonic acid bite that you get. And high alcohol definitely reduces surface tension, which prevents bubbles from forming, meaning foam is less likely and bubbles are not going to form,
right?
Because you've got so much alcohol in solution. And yeah, 16 to 17% alcohol is enough or 16 to 18%. Holy moly, that's a crazy beer.
Bigger than a wine. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's bigger than a wine. But you know, the alcohol content is going to reduce the surface tension of the bubbles. So my guess is there's a crap load of carbonation in your beer, but it's not giving you that carbonation characteristic in your mouth, right? Because it's not creating bubbles. There's not that carbonic acid bite because there's all these other things that are going in it. Anyway, that's just my guess. My guess is that there is CO2 in solution. And I would guess that even if you increase the PSI up, you know, a huge amount, you're still at some point you might get some bubble formation, but you're still just not going to get there with that high of a beer.
So I've never made an 18% alcohol beer before, so I cannot speak specifically.
Yeah, me either.
I cannot speak specifically to what Stig is asking here, but I've made 12, 13% beers, and yes, they do take longer to carbonate, even when burst carbonating, and the way that carbonation presents is definitely different. So I'm with you, Cade, that it could be that the beer does have, I mean, it's obviously going to have carbonation dissolved into it, but that the way that it's being experienced by Stig is just not the same as what he expects based on, you know, normal strength beers. But there's something that Stig said that kind of caught my eye a little bit, or caught my ear. He says that, let's see, where's it at? That when he opens up his tap, the beer sprays out, or that that the beer comes out very fast, which leaves me wondering if he's upping that PSI and then not reducing it back down to serving pressure. We call it serving pressure, which is that 12 to 14 PSI. That seems to be pretty standard for most people who keg. If you're bumping up the pressure to 30 PSI, and then you're opening your faucet after a week and it's spraying into your glass, that is going to force the CO2 that you want to stay in solution out of solution. And even just how quick that leaves your spigot, how your faucet, that will force CO2 out as well. So what you want to do, if that's the case, Stig, what you're going to want to do is reduce your not only reduce the pressure back down to 12, but you need to purge your keg. I feel like we say this over and over again in talking about burst carbonation. I get emails at least monthly, probably multiple per month, from people saying, I did the burst carbonation thing, I reduced the pressure back down to 12 PSI, and I came back 10 minutes later, and it's already back up to 25 PSI. What am I doing wrong? You're not purging your keg. You have to reduce the pressure in your keg to equalize with the pressure that you're serving pressure that you're putting back onto your keg. The easiest way to do that is to disconnect your gas altogether, then reduce your pressure, coming from your tank, purge your keg, reconnect it, and then start serving that way. And that way, all of the pressure that you forced into that liquid, into whatever strength beer you've got in your keg, it's not gonna immediately express itself as it's coming out of your faucet and then hitting your glass very, very hard, at 50 psi. Good Lord. So I wonder if that's not playing into it as well. It could be that he's doing all of that stuff properly and he's still getting zero fizz, which if that's the case, honestly, I think Cade, your response is the closest to what I would agree with and accurate, but I really don't know.
That's a really astute observation about that, coming out of the tap really quickly. I would say one of the things too, Stig, is to get a flow control faucet. And that will really help. And also what the flow control faucet will do is it'll allow you not to change anything about the keg. Because if you do, like Marshall was saying, if you purge the keg and then reduce the serving pressure down to 12, at some point the beer is going to equalize. The CO2 in solution and the head pressure is going to be the same at 12 PSI. So all that 50 PSI of carbonation that you put in there is going to come out of the beer, and it's going to come out really quickly.
Yeah.
But the flow control faucet might help you, in terms of if you want that much CO2, if you want 50 pounds per square inch of CO2 in your beer, which again, I'm not sure that you do.
No.
But if you do want that, then you're going to need the flow control faucet. I think it's much better, like what Marshall's saying, just reduce that back down to 12% and then just understand that beer with the higher alcohol concentration and everything that's going on in it is just not going to have that same carbonic perception that you're used to. But in any event, next question is from Jonathan. I think it's Bunnell. I hope that's right. He says, I'm brewing a porter that I plan to add bourbon-soaked oak chips to. My question is, will the quality of the bourbon I soak the chips in be noticeable in the finished product? Does soaking the oak chips in better bourbon translate to a smoother bourbon flavor in the final beer? Any advice you can offer is appreciated.
I love bourbon. I love whiskey. The only whiskey I'm not a big fan of is Irish whiskey. I love Scotch. I love all of the different, Kentucky, Tennessee whiskey. I love Kentucky bourbon, all that stuff. I would never waste a really good bourbon on soaking oak chips and putting it in my beer. I just think the characteristics, I don't know, Jonathan, because again, I'm not going to speak to something that I don't have direct experience with in terms of, absolute terms, but I really do not think that you're going to pick up the nuance of, a really nice bourbon from one that's, a decent, I wouldn't be using crap, plastic bottle bourbon for this, I don't think, but maybe an Elijah Craig or something like that. But I'm not going to go, use my Fry Ranch bourbon to soak oak chips in that I'm going to add to a porter, because the characteristics of that porter are just going to be so strong anyways. What you're looking for is what I would refer to as basic bourbon character, just to bump up the way that beer presents itself. And so, again, there are some bad bourbons out there. We've all come across those, and I don't know if I'd want to use that in a beer, because maybe it's going to add a boozier flavor or like a kind of a hot flavor that's just not very good. But any run of the mill kind of basic bourbon that you're comfortable sipping, on an evening, I think would work fine. I would not be using the expensive stuff. I want to drink that stuff neat.
Yeah, and I honestly have never, I don't know if I've ever brewed with oak chips. It's possible I've brewed once or twice with oak chips. It's not something that I have a lot of familiarity with, so it's not something that I would feel really comfortable giving a lot of feedback on. But it is something I've wondered with a tincture, right? When you're using a tincture to pull spices out of something, or orange peel or whatever you're doing with vodka or a distilled spirit. That's something that I've wondered. Does the quality of that spirit impact things, because you're directly pouring that spirit into beer? And while there is some of the spirit that's soaked up into the bourbon chips, really you're just getting the bourbon chips wet is what you're doing, for at least my understanding, and maybe out over my skis here. But again, like Marshall said, I don't know that I would use an expensive bourbon. I would want a bourbon that's of high enough quality that it doesn't taste like paint thinner, right? Whenever
Exactly.
It's coming out. But I don't necessarily, like you said, I'm not a huge bourbon drinker, so I don't know any expensive bourbons. but I wouldn't want to use $100 bourbon to soak my my bourbon soaked oak chips for a porter. Because just is that increase in flavor going to be that much better? I would just want it not to take away flavor or add hot characters or fusilies or anything like that.
Yeah.
So that's all I would do. And I wish I could give you more information than that, but again, this is just out over my skis. So I would say, the only thing I can think of again is that old adage, right? If you're using better ingredients, you'll have better outcomes. But honestly, I have no idea if that difference would be perceptible. That's just sort of, what I might expect to happen or might guess would happen.
Yeah, and one way that I think about, I don't brew with oak chips often at all. I've used them more than you have. It sounds like, Cade, or different types of oak products at least. So I'm by no means an expert on this, but when I drink a lot of whiskey, I'm not a wino or anything, but I do drink quite a bit of Scotch and bourbon and all of this. I love it. And when I think about good bourbon, usually what makes a really good bourbon, besides obvious quality distillation process and all of that, is the barrel character. I mean, that is what gives it its oomph. And when we think about barrel character, we're thinking about things like vanillins and maybe a little bit of coconut flavor, toasty, some caramel. Well, where does that come from? It comes from the oak barrel. And so I've had plenty of bourbon porters, in fact, that I feel like just taste like oaked porters. And in part because I'm not sure the bourbon is contributing very much. It's because of the oak components. That's what you're expecting from the oak to contribute to your porter, just the same way it does to a bourbon. Now, obviously, bourbons are aged over years. I get it, and may contribute a little bit more of that bourbon flavor as opposed to just the oaky part of it. But I wouldn't worry too much about the quality of the bourbon as long as it's something you're comfortable drinking, on your own or on its own. I think you're probably going to be fine. It would be a really interesting experiment, actually, to do the thing is, you imagine 5 gallons of beer, especially something like a porter or stout, with maybe 8 ounces max of bourbons. I mean, probably way less than that, soaked oak chips. And I think most people who are soaking their oak chips in bourbon are straining out the bourbon and then just adding the oak. So is it even really having much of an impact on quote bourbon character? The oak probably is. I mean, I would contend in my experience, at least, that it absolutely does. I'm just not sure the bourbon does. The bourbon almost serves a purpose of sanitizing the oak. That's the way I look at it. So
exactly. That's what I meant. When I said it gets wet, you're just getting it wet. You're sanitizing it.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
There we go.
That's the thing. So that would be an interesting future experiment, right? Is to do bourbon soaked oak and maybe vodka soaked oak. So they're both soaked in a spirit, and to see if what you soak it in actually contributes some sort of a noticeable characteristic to the beer. Fascinating future research. But for now, that is all we've got for our 260th episode. Huge thanks to everybody who submitted questions. I know I had a good time answering them. Cade, how about you?
Oh, always. I love this. Great questions, and thanks for helping me learn some new things like passivation and oak-soaked bourbon chips, or bourbon-soaked oak chips. Jeez, there we go. I got it.
For sanitization, right? Yeah, that's...
Right, yeah. Like I said, I'm over my skis on that one, but thanks for listening, and thank you for the awesome questions.
Yeah, if there's anything at all you'd like for us to address in a future Brü A episode, please send your questions to feedback@brulosophy.com and make sure to indicate it's for Brü A in the subject line, so we're sure to add it to the list. Don't forget to check out the Brew Lab podcast, where Cade takes you into the lab with brewing professionals to discuss the fascinating work they've done on our favorite beverage. And make sure to head over to brulosophy.com to read up on all the fun beer and brewing stuff we're up to. The Brulosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brulosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brulosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brulosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown.